So now we are for the last live session here. So we're very, very excited to have a conversation here that we have named, or we don't have named it, we have. It comes from a name, Woman, Life and Freedom. And it's going to be between our guest, which we're very happy to welcome to the campus for the first time, Pone Shams Hakimi, who's speaking and coming to us from Oberoende Svenska Iranier, independent Swedish Iranian organization, and political independent ideal organization that Pone will perhaps speak a few more words about as well. And with her is Dr. Professor Tuba Inal here at University West, who is international recognized researchers on women's rights and questions around norms around women struggle around the world, not least her work on rape legislation and rape in war and international conflicts. And they will have a conversation here around the themes. Why are we talking about women's rights in Iran right now? What does the struggle for freedom in Iran mean for women's rights around the world? And what to do now, which also ended the film about Greta that we just saw. So without further ado, let's give them a warm applaud and welcome. And thank you very much for being here.
Would you like to welcome first?
Thank you.
Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about your organization and your work before I go into my more specific questions?
Of course. Hello everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Pone Shams Hakimi and I'm a member of OSI. And what we are is basically a demonstration group. That's how we started. And we saw a need for, here in Gothenburg, to unite the Swedish Iranians that live in the city of Gothenburg. Specifically because as the death of Gina Mahsa Amini happened in September last year, there was a lot of demonstrations happening across the city around the same time. And we saw how this would be an issue in getting the Swedish society involved in being able to influence politicians to do something about the situation in Iran. And I was fortunate enough to be able to involve myself. I had a friend of mine who was an actor in Stadsteatern, and for the ones of you who know about Gothenburg, there's a big statue in the top of Avenue, which is called Götaplatsen, the statue of Poseidon, and we have the city theater there. So it's a big place for people to be able to stand and demonstrate. So we started our cooperation with Stadsteatern and was able to borrow sound equipment and all the necessities from them to be able to get our message across. And that's basically how it started. And shortly about OSI, we are completely independent politically. We don't belong to any political view. We work with politicians, we work with anyone who wants to work with us to amplify the voices of the people in Iran. And the three points that we want to focus on is freedom, is democracy, and unity. As some of you might know, there is Iran is a rich culture and have a lot of different ethnicities, and we want to strengthen this sense of unity, as the history in Iran for the at least 44 years or so have been having this tactic of dividing the people, and that's what we're trying to go against, basically.
So from what I understood from your description just now, this movement is about something more than a piece of clothing, right?
Of course. Yes.
Yeah, I have been thinking, because I mean the demonstrations which has been happening since 1979, actually, when the first hijab laws were instituted. It seems like, okay, women are protesting against the mandatory hijab law. So why do they have? And that was one of the first things that the regime did, right? To institute this law about we just created a new government, and the first policy we need to do is to cover women's heads. So I would like to ask about that. I mean, what is this movement that you're working for is about? It's yes, there is this law, and then there are women who are protesting against this. But as you said, this has much bigger implications. But at the same time, it's also about women and their hair, right?
You could say that it is a starting point in order to control women's bodies, and we've seen this in history in other situations as well. When I did my bachelor's in international relations, I wrote my thesis on the women in the Iranian diaspora, and I connected it to transnational identity, as the main focus in the course was on nation states, but I was more interested in what does that do to an identity that belongs to a nation state, and then is forced to basically cross over the nation borders to another life, to another reality. And what is funny or interesting is that in my research, it was found that the uprising in the revolution in 1979 in Iran also had women as frontiers. And there was a lot of empty promises that, of course, sadly, we realized afterwards, or our parents, the generation of my parents, understood afterwards that the revolution was, so to say, kidnapped. And there was a point where the women were going to have the symbolic hijab on for 3 days to mourn the loss of people in connection to the revolution that had happened. But during this time where this was the agreement between the new regime and the people, which everyone was, of course, happy about so far, what happened was that during this time of these 3 days of mourning and showing respect by covering yourself, it was now mandatory all of a sudden. And women who, did not agree to this lost their jobs, they lost their positions, and they got punished with not obeying. And the identity of the Iranian woman from then to now, especially when you're forced to migrate and become a part of the Iranian diaspora, is very connected to what you are allowed to wear. I've talked to women who have been living in Sweden for 10 to 15 years, and they still have when they go out, they still have this reflex to put something over their hair, put something over the head. This connection with fear, the moment you step out in society, lets us know that society has never been belonging to women during these 44 years at least.
Well, that's a very interesting point in a public space where a portion of society is basically excluded from public space unless they abide by certain rules that are put without necessarily their consent. Right? But it's interesting that also what you said with just after the revolution, women having to put on hijab to mourn, but then why would only women mourn? What did men put on to mourn the losses?
It's an interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. That didn't come up in my research. But of course, there was a lot of things promised, and on the other side, we could also ask ourselves, what did we? How did this even come to be? You know, how did it come to be that we had a shah, which is the equivalent of a king, like a monarchy, and the people were so, fed up with him that he was forced to leave his country. And when the Ayatollah came, me, who is an Iranian but born here in Sweden, a Swedish citizen, sometimes I wonder what were the other options for this to be the results. And of course, the answer can be found in the history of Iran. We have Islam is of course very dominant in the Middle East, and in Iran as well. It has been there for the last 1,400 years, and the religious, elderly, wise, that kind of position in society has been connected to status, has been connected to wisdom. And so it's interesting if you want to go back, but this is where we are right now. Yeah,
but I mean, when you go back, it's also important to understand women's movements as well in Iran. Women's movement has been very strong. If you just go back to even the early 20th century, so it's not like they just discovered, their oppression in 1979. So that's also important, I think, to understand how women have been resisting for the last 44 years. But if we take a wider perspective, and given that women's human rights are not under siege only in Iran, but all around the world, and you talked about, the state control over women's bodies, it has always been there, but it's almost making a comeback. If we look at the attempts, like starting from the U.S. to many other places in the Western and non-Western world, with abortion rights and all sorts of other controls over women's bodies. What would you say we should learn from the Iranian women? And that's why I wanted to refer back to their, struggle that goes back to many decades. But they have been fighting this at least for the last 44 years. So what would you say we should learn from them?
I think what's important to have in the back of one's mind is that women's rights are human rights. And someone fought for these rights that we now take for granted, right? So we live in a society where we are privileged to have rights to be able to go out and say what we want, dress how we want, think what we want. believe in what we want. And this has not always been the case. And I think what is very profound in this day and age, where we have technology, we have modernity, we are able to view life from across the world in our own hometown, regardless where we are in the world, if we are connected to a phone and internet. So we know more about the kind of different lives that we could lead. And as you said, the abortion laws, I'm also thinking about the Me Too movement and all that it revealed during its time. We are taking our superficial freedom for granted sometimes, because beyond the superficial, there are still structures that restrict us from our rights. And the history in Iran, I think, is not, unfortunately, not so common knowledge as it should have been. We had in the old days, from 2,500 years ago, we had Cyrus the Great, a Shah in the Persian Empire, who was the first to implement a system for human rights. And he had a cylinder, Cyrus's cylinder, and that was the main, the extracted information from the Cyrus's cylinder is the remainings from that time, and it is also implemented in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is one of the biggest documents in the United Nations, that the United Nations have to even implement human rights internationally. And what is saddening, of course, is that this is lost knowledge in time, and that what is happening right now is happening in that geographical area where there once was, something so like the world has never seen. So what the women in Iran right now are doing is, the way I see it, from a personal stance, as an Iranian, as a woman, and as someone who have, studied human rights and is actively working with it, is basically rerouting to that history and to claim what's there. Jinjian Azadi, which is translated into Zan Zendegi Azadi, which is translated into Kvinali Frihet and Woman Life Freedom, is the anthem of this revolution. And the anthem of this revolution, the meaning of it is, women bring life on earth, and life is born, every human is born free to begin with. And I think there comes a point in time with globalization, with us being able to know about how we can live a better life, where you can no longer take the position that you have been given by a man or a dictatorship. There comes a point in time where I think, and everyone have their own time, where we understand our own power, and we understand that nobody can really tell me how I should be. And also, there is no reason. Well, we cannot find a reason. Like, I'm sure many women, like myself, we've been growing up in a world seeing these injustices and asking ourselves, like, what is the reason why my voice is considered half of a man? And I'm soon 30 years old, and I have not yet found the answer. So the question is, how long should we be asking these questions? And there comes a point in time, I guess, where we realize that these questions are not answerable, and we should be living the life that we want. So to answer your question, sorry for the long-winded answer, just to not take our rights for granted, and to know that history comes and goes. It goes up and down, and the people who write history often likes to, erase what was there before. And humanity is something that emerges when there is a call for it. So we need to be awake and understand that we cannot take for granted the struggles of the people before us. We need to maintain that and making sure that it's not for it's not in vain. It was never in vain.
I think it's important, something that you said just got hooked in my mind about this thing about taken for granted, right? Because that's where you relax. It's kind of, okay, yeah, things are good now. I can just live my life. Do we have that luxury? That's the issue when it comes to human rights, right? Do you think that's what Iranian women have learned over the last at least 40, maybe more years of struggles? So if now suddenly the laws in Iran change and women get their rights, do you think that will be like, oh yes, now we're okay and we can't take it for granted? Or do you think, this long struggle have taught them to be always on guard and continue the fight?
Well, I cannot predict the future, so I have no idea. But what I want to say again is that this is a day for women and for women's rights, but something that has always been connected to human rights, to women's rights, is human rights. And as women are half of the population, maybe even more, and to understand that we can never be free and enjoy our rights as long as our neighbor or our fellow other human is suffering, that we are very connected. So I think that the struggle in Iran is so much bigger than just women's rights or women's oppression. However, I understand that as women are there is a reason why this need for control over women's bodies have been so profound in the history of international relations, like in the history of the nation state. When I studied gender studies, I learned that this concept of the core family and the stay-at-home wife was actually something that was implemented from the state. It was a recommendation from a state, and this was something it dawned upon me what that means, and how when we break loose from that, what happens with the people in power, and how powerful women actually are if we need to be controlled by state policies. So yeah.
So I mean, in connection to that, then this resistance on the part of the Iranian regime, is it, does its livelihood or longevity depend on women covering their heads?
I would think so. I'm not an expert. I've studied a couple of things and I've only lived this long, but I do believe that if I am a strong believer in, if something was enforced, it can be, that's the actual key. Like that enforcement is what we need to remove to see what else we can do. And if that was the main grip of control, then we should go back to that root and see what happens if we remove that. So if the society on a superficial level, again, because a lot of people are struggling in Iran, not just women. If we go back to seeing how society changed, and I'm not at all saying that Iran was a perfect country to live in before the revolution in '79, but on a superficial level, at least, women had more rights, and there were more options. And of course, that was another time as well. human rights had not been so fully implemented to this degree as it is today. But I do think that the removal of mandatory hijab is a key point. There is a famous journalist called Masih Alinejad, who is a big, spokesperson in this revolution. She is she's working on this basically night and day, talking to people, and on several occasions I've seen her talk about the hijab and using it as a metaphor, or connecting it to the Berlin Wall, saying that as you remove your hijab, it's like the Berlin Wall falls. And I must say that this is something I believe as well. I would love to see how a free Iran can blossom, one where people, anyone, but of course, especially women, can choose what they want to wear.
So I would just like to ask, to connect us with the Greta movie as well, that we had this discussion of. So, well, I'm asking to you, but in general, somebody who is living in Sweden and has a relatively comfortable life, why should they care and do something?
One should care and do something because we are all humans in the end. And to care and to do something is acknowledging that, in my opinion. Because in my mind, the other way around would be, well, that's not my issue. I'm living a good life. I have what I have. But then what would happen if there would be a crisis in Sweden? Or if we would be invaded? Or if these political, these policies that are in the process in Europe as well, the abortion laws, what if those questions emerge again and women have a harder life here in Europe or here in Sweden? Would we not want the world to show solidarity? So I think in the end it is a question of integrity, and that's how I view integrity, which is, if you want something out of life, then give that to life. If you want something from another person, then make sure that you're able to give that to the person. Be the change that you want to see in the world. And I think that until we live that way, there's always going to be this is my thing, that doesn't concern me, until it does. So I think that we all can benefit from putting our ego aside and listening to our humanity instead.
To be free.
To be free.
Well, do we have more time?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask personally about you as well. Why do you care? I mean, aside from this fact that, yes, you have the integrity to care, but as a person, when did you start thinking about, I should care about this issue and do something? Because caring is one thing. Care, but then I have to invest my time in this, go out and protest and go to Högskolan Väst and spend some time there to communicate these messages. What was the point that you decided that?
I think it was not a mental decision. It was more from the heart, and it was a bodily reaction. I just found myself posting because I saw that this was happening, and having the history of knowing, my parents fled from Iran, seeing what that did to them, seeing them, missing their homeland and understanding that if they had a choice, they would have stayed there. They love their culture and their music and their poetry and the nature and the people, So knowing these things, and then of course growing up, always learning that when I call back to the relatives in Iran, don't ask them political questions, because you don't want to risk them, something bad happening to them, or if the government would, listen to the calls. There's always been this overarching fear, like this big gray cloud covering all the beauty that I grew up with in my family. And seeing this, seeing what happened in September, it was just so devastating. Like the death of Gina Mahsa Amini was just so devastating, in a way I don't think any of us could have expected. Just the innocence of, she wasn't even doing something to provoke anyone. Like it was not an act of provocation or anything like that. And I think that it's a kind of breaking point that happens in people, of course, who are connected to this issue and maybe have roots or relatives or people they know from Iran, to know that it doesn't matter what you do. God forbid if the wind would fly through your hair and a couple of strings would fall out of your hijab, it will get you killed. And that was, I think it was so evident, it was so black and white. And I cannot say what everyone else's reasons are, but that was devastating for me to see that it would go so far, and it was so normalized. And then it's kind of a wake-up call. Just like an individual person, can go on working day and night, and then, I don't know, having a heart attack, waking up and being like, oh, maybe I should stop. I'm not sure. Maybe this is what happened on a nationwide scale. Like, how long are we going to pretend that this is normal? Yeah. So for me, that's just what happened. I started sharing, and I realized that the world is not caring about this, because Middle East is Middle East, and we have this Western foreign policies on the Middle East for our own agendas. The Western nations want the resources there, so they need to have a reason to be there. And a good reason to be there is to give a negative, stereotypical view of that people in that region, to be able to exploit these resources. But in the end, knowing the truth in all of this is like, how long are we gonna uphold other people's stories that are exploiting us on all these different levels? So I think I understood pretty fast that media is not covering this. And growing up as an Iranian, as a body from the Middle East in a Western country, seeing how news is spread and what it focuses on, it's pretty evident that news is financed, and that it's not necessarily a correct view of what's happening, or even a proportional view of what's happening. So I just felt a big responsibility to share, because I know that the voices in Iran are not being heard. The internet is shut down, and this is a strategy that they use. They shut down internet so that the world cannot see those, so that they can do whatever they want, kill Iranian people. So I just felt like there was a responsibility to spread awareness, as there was lack. And also the responsibility in itself is the ability to respond. So that again goes back to a sense of humanity, a sense of like, that struggle is my struggle. And if this is what the people in Iran are asking, then they have a clear desire. At least this is what I can do.
Who should and can do what as part of our daily fight, as citizens, to uphold human rights in general, and to uphold human rights as friends of the Iranian women.
I think it's not for me to say who should and who shouldn't. I think we should all take a look at ourselves and review what's important to us. What is it that gives us joy in life? What are the things we are enjoying, and what are the privileges that we have? And considering having them lost, what kind of life would that be, and would we be able to bear it for how long? And how would our worldview change if we would know that there are people around us who know and who can support us, who can show solidarity, but chose not to because it's not their concern? And just reflecting on a bigger scale on what does that do to a person, what does that do to society, knowing that they're viewed that way from the rest of the world, and then what does that tell us about human beings and humanity? So I think that the more questions we ask ourselves, the more we reach a core that can be awakened, and then I'm pretty sure we all know what to do in the end.